What's going on, everybody? Today we're going to talk about game development failure, what classifies as failure within the games industry, and what you guys can do to avoid it. If that sounds interesting and you want to learn more, then stick around. Now, first we need to ask ourselves, what is failure? In an industry like the games industry, with all of its intricacies, it makes defining failure an extremely complex task, and it is unique to every single developer or studio. There are some obvious low-hanging scenarios that we've seen within the industry, and I'm going to get to that. Feel fish! But from a personal point of view, we can define failure in two different ways. The first form of failure is the most commonly known one, and that is a lack of success. But the second one is the neglect of an expected or required action. I know it sounds wordy, but what does it mean? Well, one is intrinsic, which is dependent on factors which you yourself control. The other is extrinsic, which is based on factors that are out of your control. You may have some influence on it, but you do not control it. So now that we've defined that, let's talk about how game development failure really rears its head. It happens in a number of ways, but it always comes down to these following points. Now, the first one is not making enough sales or money, not finishing your game, and quitting game development. There are a lot of nuanced ways that we could define failure in the industry, but it always comes back to these three. It's always one of these things which occur that really define a game or a developer or a studio as a failure. So let's go over them and let's break down what kind of failure that is and what we can do to avoid it. Now, the first form of failure in the game development industry is where a game doesn't actually make enough sales to cover its own development costs. Now, you can't force people to pay for your game. It is an extrinsic form of failure. Your failure stemmed from the fact that people did not want to spend money on your game, your product. And that can be of no fault of your own. You may have marketed your game to the right demographic using the right channels. You may have hit a genre of game just as it was beginning to trend. But at the end of the day, you cannot force people to buy your game. Therefore, that is an extrinsic form of failure. Now, one way that you can manage, influence, and potentially mitigate this failure is by not overspending what budget you have. That in itself is something that you control. You control your budget by having a sensible and effective development time. You can control your budget by marketing effectively to the right channels. You can manage your budget by choosing the right publisher for you or your studio. These are just some of the things you need to consider for you to help minimize the number of sales that you need to reach before your game becomes profitable and before your game is considered a commercial success. A second form of failure within the industry is where games just don't happen to get finished. Now, there are 1,000,001 ways that a game can wind up unfinished, and we could be here all day listing them all out. But at the end of the day, a game winds up unfinished, especially for solo or indie devs, because of an intrinsic failure. They either lost faith in themselves or their resilience wore out, and games wind up unfinished. For bigger games developed by bigger studios, lawsuits can be involved, cease and desist, and it's on a case-by-case basis. So something like that can't necessarily be defined within this video. I'm talking more on the level of an indie developer and the factors which influence them to stop making their game. Now, an indie developer might receive a cease and desist from a bigger studio for infringing on a part of their intellectual property. In that case, don't make your game a clone of another game, or don't use the name of a big IP within your game. It just makes sense. Another reason a game might not end up being finished is because the developer just ran out of money and were unable to fund themselves during development. This stems back to failure number one, where you overspent. But in this case, you overspent to the point where you are unable to continue developing this game on a commercial level. Now, if you've signed with a publisher or if you've received funding in some way, then you might be contractually obliged to complete the game, or you might have to hand over your intellectual property to that publisher, pending the clauses within the contract. If you've stopped working on your game because you've just lost faith in yourself, or something else has come around that really interests you and you want to try and pursue that prototype or that game, then stop, check yourself, think about all the work you've done on your project, and really double down and commit yourself to finishing this game. For every game that you start but don't finish, that is a form of failure. You're failing to train yourself up in the skill on how to finish a game and how to release a game. What you're doing is you're cutting yourself off at the knees. and you're not becoming that top 5% of developer who can actually finish a game or finish a project that they start. So don't do it. Now, this can actually lead into the third form of failure within the games industry, and that is quitting the game development industry altogether. This is about as intrinsic as it can get. You control all of the factors that determine whether or not you should continue to make games. Are you passionate? Do you have the drive? Do you have the skills? By just quitting games, then you're potentially robbing an audience of a game that you could have made. There's no surefire way to combat this. There are hundreds of thousands of developers that have quit game development because it's either gotten too hard or they've lost belief within themselves. But to be a great game developer, you need to consistently fail. You need to constantly fall. But when you fall, you're going to fall forward and then get up, and you're going to be in a different position that you were when you started. At least at that stage, you have some perspective and you've learned some lessons. You know what not to do. You know what you should have done in this situation. You've gained a level of wisdom within the industry, and you have a better idea on what to do next so you can avoid that failure. So that's what failure looks like within the industry, but how can we avoid it moving forward? Well, one surefire way to avoid failure is to literally just change your definition of success. If your definition of success is to be bigger than EA and Valve and Blizzard, then you really need to check yourself on what success really means within the industry. These companies started decades ago. They've got hundreds of staff. They've got a huge audience. They have a vast catalog of games, and they have the capability of spending thousands of hours of development time on a game that's going to be bigger, that's going to look better, that's going to play better, that's going to be more bug-free, and is going to sell a hell of a lot better than any game that you're probably going to make. Real talk. It's important that you don't try to compete with these players on their level. It's just not achievable, especially if you're a one-man band. Essentially, you need to move the goalpost to something that is more achievable. Now, there are a number of ways you can do this. Now, you can make a game to learn how to code, how to learn a new engine, how to 3D model, how to animate. Whatever your goal when you're creating a game is, so long as you come out on the other end having learned that skill, then guess what? You've won, you've achieved something, and that's success. Another way that you can succeed as a game developer is to just make a game for fun. You shouldn't see it as time that's wasted, because what you're doing is you're practicing and you're training, and you're actually growing this passion for game development we all have. At the end of the day, if we're not enjoying it, then we're not going to be motivated to work on our game when times get tough and there's a lot of dark work, which is stuff that you don't necessarily see. If you make a game for fun and you have fun doing it, then you win every time. Another way to succeed as a game developer is to not make an MMO for your first game, because you don't have the time, the budget, or the expertise to be able to do that. Really keep the scope small and keep it achievable. Follow a tutorial if you're not sure how to do something, but if you keep the scope small and you achieve that goal and you finish a game and you release it, that's success. Another way to avoid failure within the industry is to do everything that you physically can to make your game successful in your own eyes, and it's all dependent on what you see as success. Your game could be a financial success. You could make enough sales to cover your development costs, plus $40,000 over a 6-month period. That's great, that's a financial success. You could sell merchandise to your game if that's the route that you want to go. You could make money that way. So long as you are covering your costs and you're achieving the number that you want to achieve, then that's a success. Success can be seen through some accolades. You could receive awards or you could receive praise from critics. If that's your version of success, then great, that's success. You could define success as building yourself a huge audience and having a core set of loyal fans. Games media might pick up your game and do a write-up on it, or might want to interview you. Influencers might pick up your game and it might gain some viral success. You might build an audience that way. That's success as well. And if that's your definition of success, then great. Like I said, you just need to work really hard, and there's a chance that you could achieve this. A third way to avoid failure is just being lucky. A lot of developers will say that game development success comes down to luck. And yes, there is an element of luck that you just can't predict. but there are a lot of factors and trends that you can predict and you can ride to give yourself the best opportunity at succeeding as a game developer, whatever your definition of success is. Now, all of these points are just as valid as one another. One doesn't make you better or a higher tier developer than the other. What is important though is that you are continually driving yourself to learn and grow in a pace that you're comfortable with, in a way that is less daunting and achievable for yourself. If you do this consistently, you're not going to fail, you will be successful. Another way to avoid failure in the games industry is to subscribe to this channel, share, like, and comment below. Tell us how you failed as a game developer, what you've done to pick yourself up, and how you're tracking your way towards success. The next topic I'm going to talk about is how we can identify and eliminate procrastination as a game developer. So if that interests you, then tune in next week.